Buen día, buenos días. Bienvenidas al segundo seminario del ciclo Sex and Gender Bias in AI and Healthcare, Building a Future for Equity. Es organizado por el programa Bioinfo for Women del Barcelona Supercomputing Center junto con la Fundación La Caixa aquí en el Palau Macaya. Mi nombre es Atia Cortés, soy investigadora postdoctoral del Barcelona Supercomputing Center en el Departamento de Life Science y hoy voy a ser la moderadora de esta sesión. En el primer seminario
In the first seminar a month ago, we had 4 speakers who gave us their perspective on the importance of including sex and gender perspective in science investigation as well as clinical and biomedical practice to get personalized quality medical care. Today I have the honor of having 4 great women here with me who will be tackling social, ethical and technological challenges in the biases of sex and gender in AI and health. We'll be talking about the different kinds of biases, about the needs for an ethical and legal framework for the use of artificial intelligence and some best practices examples in order to develop this responsible artificial intelligence that will help us improve medical investigation. I will now introduce today's speakers. To my right is Professor Karina Gibert. Is a professor at the Polytechnical University in Catalonia. She's a co-founder and investigator at the IDEAI-UPC group. She's the Associate Dean in the College of Computer Science, founder of the COEINF Foundation, and the founder of Women in a Cap for the Catalan Association of Artificial Intelligence. She's also the co-ambassador of Women in Data Sciences at Stanford University, as well as an investigator in different areas concerning artificial intelligence, feminism, and science. Itziar de Lecuona is an associate professor at the medical school at University of Barcelona, as well as an adjunct director at the Bioethics and Law Observatory. And she's also has a seat at the UNESCO chair in bioethics and also works for the Ministry of Science and Innovation. Her main line of investigation is concerned with the legal social aspects of biotechnology and medicine, as well as the use of emerging technologies in the health area. Via Zoom, already online, is Professor Allison Gardner. She's a data science professor at Keele University and also a professor, director of the program Data Science degree, and also a founder of Women in AI. Her investigation concerns with algorithmic biases in computation. She works with different British and international standards concerning with artificial intelligence and algorithmic systems. She's also part of the International Committee in the United Kingdom for the British Standard of Artificial Intelligence. Finally, Dr. Gardner is the CEO of AI Aware. And here in the middle, we have Professor Paula Petrone, who is the professor at ISGLOBAL, where she directs the team of biomedical data. She's also founder of the startup Phenobyte Life, concerned with innovation and technology in the health area. She has a degree, a doctorate at Stanford University, and has been working with data sciences, including the discovery of new drugs, medical imaging, and early detection of diseases. So thank you, the 4 of you, for being with us today. We'll start with listening to your presentations, and afterwards we'll have a roundtable with the 4 of you, and we'll finally open up the floor in case the audience has any questions they might like to ask. So in the order where I introduce you, Karina, you have the floor. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. Thank you very much, Atia, for organizing this seminar and the whole cycle and for having me. Before we start, I just give you a little spoiler. We're talking about gender bias and gender perspective and that kind of thing. I'm a computer engineer. Our college is not an engineering college. In its inception, it is a college in computer engineering, precisely because it wanted to incorporate this gender perspective. So today I'm going to be sharing some thoughts that I have considered around this subject on the impact and the challenges of these gender and sex biases in artificial intelligence and health in particular, And I'm just going to give you some context to start with and, share this personal idea of where I think these biases are more concentrated. I'll be very brief because we don't really have a lot of time. And I'm assuming everyone in the audience is aware of what artificial intelligence is, but just in case, this is born in 1956 at the Dartmouth Summer School, organized by McCarthy, together with the creme de la creme of the time. Were the most relevant people who started this discipline. And in the summer school, the challenge was to spend 2 months thinking about whether it was true that aspects that require human intelligence could be specified so precisely that a machine might be able to simulate, to execute them. So this is where this whole endeavor, where we're all diving in, was born. So over the past few years, this has boomed in a rather significant way, and we find a rather designed growth even at the industrial level, not just at the research level. And practically every state is concerned with how to organize this matter. So we have a European strategy which is really recent. It was published in 2020. We had this white paper on AI by the European Commission, which fosters this idea of people-centered AI, very respectful of human rights, and with a rather conservative vision in comparison to what other countries such as China and the United States are doing. Towards the end of last year, the Spanish strategy for AI is born, also with this people-centered vision, and I'm not going to concern myself with talking about strategies today. And February 2020, Catalonia was also one of the first territories in Spain, and one of the few stateless territories to have a public government strategy on AI. And it also keeps with this people-centered AI. In all these contexts, there is a concern, or we can subsume a concern over ethical aspects. And I would like to underline a couple of things that are important. I'm not going to go into ethics definitions, but ethic does define what values and counter-values are. It defines these value scales that sort of organize what we do or what we don't do, and what is has a good consideration or a bad standing. And it is always a social consensus. Obviously, with years, some ethical systems end up being regulated, but basically ethics is born out of context, and it is very dependent on cultural context. So ethics are pretty much locally based. So when Europe, for instance, tries to standardize an ethical framework for artificial intelligence, it has had to work with ethics of consensus, because Spanish ethics is not Swedish ethics. So we always find ourselves at this trade-off between what is ethical at the local level and what can be agreed upon with larger, broader territories, which appeals to more generic principles. Another principle that I deeply believe in is that technology is neutral on the offset, but what may or may not be ethical is the way it is employed or implemented, or the way it becomes inserted into any given context. And that is where we, as human beings, can make decisions throughout the entire chain of values, from how this IA is created to how it is consumed at the other end. Catalonia has always been a pioneer in the ethics field. In 2017, we have a declaration on IA, which is already calling attention to these ethical problems. Europe makes its recommendation in April 2018, and they set this people-centered model based on 8 axes, which is concerned with things, for instance, this is AI application to respect human rights and privacy, and for them to be transparent, etc., etc. Some of these axes come into conflict with each other, so we need to find the middle ground, and it is important to keep them in mind from the very conception of the AI application, for them to be able to be respected from the design. And among them, we find this concern with preventing bias, to have a non-discriminatory AI. And obviously, one of the biases has to do with sex and gender. So before I start, I'd just like to give you a preview, which has to do not so much with AI, but rather with the representation of knowledge in its purest form. We find now ourselves in an argument on whether we need to register sex and gender in people, so sex being the biological objective, we're men and women since we're born. This is not something you can change. There's a tiny percentage of people who are in a third sex, sort of intersex, hermaphrodite, and they're never represented into any database, but these people exist. I personally know 2 of them. And then finally, we have this perception-based feeling on the personal feeling, which is what we call gender, where we find masculine, feminine, this non-binary that seems to be becoming standardized in databases. And this starts an argument. What do we need to ask when we, for instance, make a census of a population, or when a patient arrives to the hospital and we want to discharge or register them? And I believe there's no room for an argument, and my position is very strong in this. We may not give up any of these options because they're both ambiguous, and they will never allow us to make a database analysis that is correct enough. Is that right? And let me explain. It is very important to know a patient's biological sex because some diseases are directly linked to a person's biological sex. We cannot predict on how the population, the incidence of prostate cancer is going to progress in our population if we don't know the sex of people. We can't know what resources we need to destine to gynecologists who will be able to treat myomas. We wouldn't be able to have any reliable estimates on cardiovascular disease risk if we are not, if we don't have the biological sex available. Obviously, some diseases are directly related to menstruation, to women's biological condition, for example, low iron anemia, osteoporosis, etc. If we want to do preventive medicine, we need to know biologically what biological sex person X has. On the other hand, obviously, it's very important to know the gender, because some pathologies are directly linked to each gender. And some mental health aspects in some environments, and obviously this is not generalized, but suicide instincts in a subpopulation, for instance, of people who perceive their gender as different to their biological sex is higher than the general population, and so on and so forth. Some diseases come directly from some therapies that are typical in this kind of population, such as an increase in cardiovascular risk related to hormone replacement therapy. And we see that in women who go through hormone therapy in their menopausal age, which is close, the consequences of these kind of diseases. Silicone injections also come with complications that only have a long-term expression in the health of people. And obviously, it is therefore important, if we want to have preventive medicine meant to keep the health of people, this is information that we need to have. And neither of this information is telling us whether the person belongs or does not belong to the LGBTI collective, which is yet another layer. So that's another information we might need to have. So when we bring in the gender variable, if someone is listing non-binary gender, we have no way of knowing if this is a man that feels he's a woman or a woman who feels like he's a man. So in order to do data analysis, in order to know how diseases will evolve related to gender and sex, this is non-resolutive information. So this is something we need to keep in mind, this definition. For these personalized medicine models, and even for epidemiological guesstimates, will reduce the effectiveness of this data. And the big dilemma, and obviously you can see there's a great ethical dilemma here, which is, on the one hand, how can we uphold these preventive medicine models and these epidemiological models and make them more reliable and more precise? And on the other hand, we have the right to privacy, the right to one's own gender identity, and the right to privacy to each individual. And that's a dilemma we have on the table. So that's on the one hand. And then if we look into challenges concerning sex and gender in the health area particularly, we have these three different spaces. We have biases in the design of algorithms, and then there are biases in the design of training data, and finally biases in interpretation. And these biases come with the risk of increasing social inequality and penalize or punish specific kinds of populations. So I have three very brief examples because I don't want to go on too long. But we already know that all biometric applications have been training for a long time, basically with pictures of white Caucasian males. So these systems are better able to recognize men who follow these patterns and don't work so well with other patterns. Well, if we take this and try to apply it to, for instance, let's picture we're training a diagnostic system based on medical imaging who's trying to identify, for instance, COVID based on X-rays. If during the first wave of COVID, most people in hospitals were male, and so the machine was all trained with male lungs, obviously a man's lung capacity is not the same as a woman, so obviously the model is going to be biased for sure. So this is something we need to keep in mind. And this ties in with the idea that these algorithms, this diagnosis, the algorithms that someone diagnosed need to be supervised, and thus is linked with the first axis of the European proposal, to keep humans in the loop at all times. However, this comes into conflict with the notion that we might always need to supervise artificial intelligence. When we talk about robotics, we can't be supervising all the time. We can obviously supervise diagnostic applications between the machine diagnostic and the one that is ultimately given to the patient. There needs to be a human supervisor. But there are other instances where supervision of IA is not viable. And this is beyond the bias and gender biases, but this is something that we need to take into account. Something else we see in IA is that the algorithm's very design sometimes magnifies biases. Let's picture we have an algorithm that prioritizes who prioritizes triage in an emergency room. And this is a classical application that works with historical data. So let's picture a disease that more women suffer than men. So the system what's going to do is that the most serious cases require most expensive treatment and have a higher mortality rate. And therefore, if the algorithm isn't well designed, we might have a ruling efficiency criterion which might find that these more serious cases are the least successful. So the algorithm might prioritize the most successful ones, which are the people suffering from less serious disease. So certainly, if we have this waiting room where the most serious cases will be left behind and is going to be treating the less serious diseases first. So we'd basically be leaving the most serious cases die in emergency rooms. This is a very clear paradigmatic case on how algorithm design, where if you switch criteria, we might get rid of this bias. Obviously, if we keep in mind that women tend to go later to the emergency room, later than men, which is an innate tendency that we have, obviously this will impact the gender bias. Okay, what else? Another issue that we're facing is that since there's such a dearth in feminine talent in the teams that create or that design artificial intelligence, the diversity in teams is rather low. So these designs do share a more homogeneous look. And what we're losing is this ability to see things from a different perspective and consider other things that women need that men don't. And there's a very silly example that I always use, which is not directly related to IA, but car design, the way the wheel is set up, it makes everyone drive with their legs spread. And I wonder what would have happened if, when cars were first being designed towards the middle of the 20th century, you'd had women in design teams. Cars would probably not look like that, because this is not a position that women find ourselves particularly comfortable in. And I think this is a good example of this consequence of a lack of female talent in professional teams that ultimately generate in artificial intelligence applications. We see the same with these flaws. If a woman wants to wear heels, she's going to probably break a leg. If you're a woman in charge of urban design, you probably consider things like this. And in the video game world, and there was this there was an application that had to do with the rehabilitation of patients with neurological damage, such as Guttman Hospital. The Guttman Institute has a very well-known one, and I collaborated with them for a long time. It's very important to have both men and women designing the characters in these kind of video games, because otherwise we'll see things like this, with a female character answers to stereotypes that do not equal the design of male characters. This is what I'll call the design inherent masculine bias. And it will only be solved through the incorporation of other outlooks, not just female, but maybe people with sensory divergence, people who are hearing impaired or vision impaired. So we might design different interfaces to use these artificial intelligences. Finally, biases in interpretation. This is an age-old problem, has not necessarily to do with IA. It's just the lurking variables, which is a very well-known phenomenon in statistics, which has to do with the Simpson's paradox, and which has to do with the confusion of effects. Let's picture something. There's a belief, as there has been for a long time, that obstructive lung disease was mostly a male occurrence, but that's actually not the case. The main cause of EPOC is smoking. What was true for a very long time is that smokers were mostly men. So if we don't take this into account, what we'll find is that we'll start thinking that men need to be looked at more closely to keep them from developing this disease and do prevention against it, where actually what you should be following smokers, whether they're men and women, and there's an inherent gender bias in that. Because if you forget about women, you'll detect the disease later and they'll have a much worse prognosis. And obviously, this is a problem of a confusion of the correlation of data with the causality and these hidden variables. And this is a very well-known interpretation problem. At ISGLOBAL project, which is a program to detect social vulnerabilities in the face of COVID-19, we encountered a similar situation when it comes to social vulnerability. We had much less women who'd gone into temporary occupation regulation experience. So it could allow us to make a superficial interpretation where it's like, oh, women are being less affected by the crisis. And that's a lie. What was happening is that most of the women participating in our studies about vulnerable populations were in highly precarized occupations. They didn't even have a contract. So how could how could they be furloughed? So obviously, this is the same kind of issue we're facing. And this all impacts directly the different accesses of this trustworthy AI. So we talked about privacy, and I'm sure one of my colleagues here today is going to go further into this. And I just wanted to highlight two things. One, we have this data representativity is key for data not to be biased, which is an age-old problem in statistics, and that is solved by making a good sample design, which doesn't stop at just gathering the data as they come. No study, medical or social or any kind of discipline, using Twitter data can be not biased, because women older than 80 don't even have a Twitter account. So they'll never be represented in any sentiment analysis, in any kind of study based on Twitter data. And I'm almost done here. Something else we need to keep in mind is the concept of this sort of very narrow concept that we have of anonymizing data, where it seems in medicine, if you just remove the name and address and phone number in a patient, you can just do anything with that data. And that's not the case. When we start looking for multifactorial patterns, if we cross many different variables, these randomized anonymous data could end up forming such tiny patterns that allow you to identify the individual. And that's what happens, for instance, with victims of domestic abuse. So these abused women are such a small subgroup within the total, and they're scattered so much all over the place that they may end up being perfectly identifiable. So this is something that we need to keep in mind, how to preserve statistical secret. All right, so I'm going to stop here. And basically, that's the summary. We need both information, gender and sex, in order to create trustworthy models. And these biases are at every step of the chain, of the value chain in these applications of this data-based and artificial intelligence-based apps. Thank you. All right. So we can now move on to the Lecuona.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers and for having invited me. I've worked with them in the past, and I hope to be able to do so, to keep on doing so in the future. Let me introduce myself again. And I'm going to just jump over all of the things that have already been mentioned. You will see that I agree with her, and that will enrich the discussion. I'm going to talk about the philosophy of law. I am a professor of the Faculty of Medicine and Social Sciences, and I've been working for 20 years in this field, in the field of biomedical research, especially with regards to the analysis of research and innovation processes, to actually talk about ethical and bioethical issues and its social impact. And today's event is very important because, as you know, we are going towards responsible innovation research, especially in the field of medicine and new technologies, which forces us to focus on the patient, on the user, which will force us, if it's not doing so already, to having an open code, open source, especially in terms of gender equality and issues related to scientific education. This is a cross-sectional issue, and it should be actually taken into account. Within this framework, towards this responsible innovation research, and focusing on gender issues and other related topics in the field of biomedical research, I'm going to make a contribution that's theoretical and practical at the same time. Given my cumulative experience in my job, I've developed a consulting activity that focuses on the research products analysis that is interdisciplinary before this starts. All of these innovation processes in which AI and big data and the convergence of these technologies is applied in a routine fashion. It's not an issue that we're anticipating, but it is already happening, and this has to be borne in mind. Okay, I'm going to identify a number of principles that will allow us, they have been identified, but they will allow us to make headway in the creation of a theoretical framework that will be useful for the digital society in which we live, which has absolutely nothing to do with issues that are necessary. It has nothing to do with the analog society in which we built up our knowledge, and most of the people who are leading this process have been actually trained in the analog world. the ethical patterns and also the issue of digital literacy. So we will connect these principles with a number of rights that will be affected when we develop a website or a solution, so that it includes all of this theoretical framework. You will see it as a bias probably, but I'm going to refer to the pattern because nothing has to do, no, the European AI pattern with other contexts. We'll have discussed this. We can't have something that's necessary if there are universal principles to aspire to have an AI that's universal at all times. Then what I will also do is to get into a crucial issue. It's not that everything is yet to be done. It's not that we do not have rules and regulations to be used as a framework which may fall given this hurdle, because there are rule responses, but it's hard to understand the digital paradigm in which we're living. It's hard for us to understand what this change actually means. And I'm going to highlight a number of technical aspects that condition the discussion and they condition the ethical response. If we do not understand the problems we're facing, and this has been just said, if we keep on saying that data are anonymous when in fact they are not, and when people are identifiable in any process and context, given the enormous amount of data that we give voluntarily or involuntarily, I mean, we can't guarantee, and it is not right to guarantee any data. Imagine processes that are related to genetic disorders. I mean, that has been explained very well with examples. So my goal is to contribute with ideas and knowledge in order to build up a solid and consistent discussion based on the analysis of technical problems to make headway in the ethical response, the legal response, and of course, without forgetting the social impact aspect of it. But I'm going to bring forth a critical perspective, and I haven't got the time, and we have the Q&A and the discussion, and I brought a PowerPoint presentation, and in order to keep the time that has been allotted to me. We are at a time in which there is a trend to accumulating data. Groups of data that also change the focus, they change the analysis, they force us to look at them from a different perspective, and then the threat involved by the algorithmic discrimination from the point of view of society, not only for individuals, but also for groups and for democracy itself. We have seen this clearly with the analytics and other examples that are purely medical and that affect us all. So this critical gaze is interesting to me. Now, these issues have been collected in the Bioethics and Law Observatory, which is a center I lead currently. We have collected all of these issues that I'm going to share with you in a document that's in open source to make headway in the construction of patterns given the personal data and emerging technologies. And that would be the ultimate result of our interdisciplinary work. Our people have cooperated in it. So I'm going to give you examples from the pandemic. I think it's important to see how the pandemic has really brought to the surface what was happening for a number of years. AI started in 2000, but right before the pandemic, the European Commissioner Claire said she presented her digital strategy and her AI strategy before 19th of February 2020. The pandemic, well, made us concentrate on other issues because in addition to critical gaze, we have to think about the excessive dependency on American technological companies, the lack of European infrastructures, and if we do not solve that, we will be always dependent and with a different philosophy. I'm not saying it's going to be bad, but it's not adequate. And of course, this economy of attention in which we're all immersed and we all contribute. We are all responsible for what we have. And it's not only the technological companies, but also the common citizen is empowered to know what he or she is exposed to. So we see, for example, that in the biomedical issue, and this is what we've been analyzing in the last few times, we analyze hackathons, which are, well, there is an algorithm that gives us scientific data from, very important researchers, well, to find out whether we will have cancer or not. But when we ask ethical questions in research, we do not talk about AI systems that could predict this through these behavioral patterns and to allow us to make decisions. This is not an isolated issue. It's a decided European. It's a political, scientific, and economic decision. It's part of the 2020 agenda. People who are leading very competitive research projects. And what does Europe want? Europe wants a single digital market to identify conflicts in which personalized medicine and health systems have to be more efficient. And the proactive aging is a priority. And proactive aging is associated to what has been previously said. We're monitoring people at home with sensors, which is highly invasive, with patents and under control, so that the system is sustainable. Because if not, Europe will not have enough money, to say it in plain words, to actually be at the spearhead of these situations. This is in biomedical, this is that we have intelligent cities, etc., etc. But I'm going to focus on people through the protection of personal data, and this is what I defend: the protection of personal data nowadays by all of the operators who are working. And for sure, a lot of them will not see anybody. They will not have a patient in front. They will use databases, and they have a responsibility for these people, because the responsibility is in the protection of these data. And we see how this has changed. There are vaccines developed, and we have also the development of medicines and drugs. We are making headway in basic science knowledge, but we see what do pharmaceutical companies? They actually have agreements with genetic companies that apply all of the systems. They have full databases, and they are reaching agreements to be able to use this data to develop drugs. These are databases that are not as perfect as the ones we find in the health system, but with time, resources, and knowledge, and the right hypotheses, they can actually make headway. So here we have the deontological rights, ethical issues, etc. at stake. And this is quite relevant because it changes the problem and the focus and the response we have to give to it. And then we have to understand what I've said beforehand. I'm going to repeat it again. We have stopped being anonymous to be identifiable, and we've stopped being just a piece of data that's isolated to be groups of data. And this is what gives power to third parties. And these third parties have to play by the rules of the game in this league of numerical research, because you need infrastructures, you need knowledge that comes from profiles that did not have they did not receive an ethical class. They were not aware, because these were not the profiles. They were not there. And now they are in the midst of it. Now they do have a responsibility. In fact, data scientists, computer scientists, and engineers they want this type of training because they have a responsibility. They have a liability. They're liable. They wonder about the justice and the liability of the algorithm. A clear case is the automatic or the autonomous car, and they are liable, and they know it. And we are being led by professionals who are leaders in the biomedical issue because they are devoted to research, but there are many other operators who are also involved. And when I talk about operators, I use the term in a generic sense, from the researcher all the way to the data manager or any actor. And this is a responsibility that's shared by by all of them. Now, what is actually being done now is to look for a response without analyzing the previous issue, which is who defines the patterns, what do we assess, and who controls the controller. Because now what we're claiming for, when we talk about AI in systems, and we have gone towards AI. 2 days ago, we talked about big data, and we haven't really had a well-informed group. Everything goes too fast. But what they are talking about is that there must be audit certification systems for algorithms. And the fact is that what happens in innovation and research processes are ethical interdisciplinary committees who are assessing these research projects, and they are sent all of the innovation. For example, an application for the tracing back, for the identification and tracing back of positives and contagion, because we're all looking for a quality seal, a guarantee, a warranty. And if you have an activity or an action in the biomedical domain, it's large hospitals, large private institutions who certify these systems. But those who are evaluating these they are not AI experts. There isn't a diversity, a wide enough profile diversity, nor the knowledge, nor the representation of the legal, which is what I have said beforehand, i.e. the layman or woman, to make decisions. In this domain, ethical on research committees are composed by pharmacologists, medicals, and tourists. I mean, there isn't a person who represents the engineer, and he has to be there. But the engineer also gives information. So, and this is something we need to solve, and it cannot be done based on just decrees and laws. We need to have digital literacy and education, because digital literacy is a more generic issue for the citizen to know what are the asymmetries and what power games he or she is facing, who has my data, and which decision will be taken on my behalf, because I can be subject to a covered discrimination that I'll know about. If a third party, I mean, they always talk about banks or insurance companies. In the digital world, if we do not know what data they have, it's a situation we can't control. A patient will never question all of the things we're questioning here, because it's a fully asymmetrical relationship, of course. So this issue is also quite a relevant one. So I'm worried, I'm concerned by the fact that the technological solution, I mean, that technology by itself will be better than the human decision. The ROM-home, the digital ROM-home, and all of these digital feudalism we're facing has not been analyzed adequately to find this technical solution. And we have to find it in the ethical response. AI, as of today, is not that clever. Well, and it will give us some time, fortunately, to improve the ethical perspective about it. And what I said beforehand, in this context, those who are AI experts, what they say is that we need, in order to avoid these biases, which do exist in reality, first, we need to analyze the data previously. We have to clean up the data, quality data, but that's why everybody wants to get into this. And in Catalonia, we have a significant bet. We have one of the reference values under quality conditions. I mean, this is gold, but for a company's profit, but there are interests we need to identify as well. And that's why I also say that we are at a turning point that if we do not take control and we do not know what we're facing, in fact, we are promoting data markets that are presented as research markets. What we saw in the 20th century and what we thought was research, now it also includes other issues, which are the ones I'm mentioning here. That gold, that oil, which with the gender, your birth date and your zip code, we are, well, just game in a very high percentage. In the biomedical domain, we can't stop it. We can't refrain from having this data, but we also, we go back to a basic point. I mean, research, there is less research being made on women than on men. And this is a fact, and this has to be known. So how can't there be a bias in the algorithmic context as well? The example of Cambridge Analytica is something I've analyzed because it links up with our times. And as Gibert says, what we need to do is to face the challenge of regulating technology, these technologies, these emerging and converging technologies. At the end of the day, we're getting into the dignity and the control of people's lives. And that's what has been said beforehand. That's how it is being done. The last part of my presentation, in the time that has been allotted to me for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the algorithmic discrimination, not only related to the gender bias, but for other reasons. And in order to contribute a number of solutions, I'm going to give this more critical vision. And we need to understand that bias exists, the algorithmic bias exists. We have to identify the risk threshold we are ready to accept as society. And through this analysis and what we're discussing here, which needs to be transferred to society, we need to determine the place in the societal rationale occupied by AI. What place should we give and what value should we give to AI? And for this, there are already responses. And these are, well, regulatory responses, like, for example, the general rules and regulations on data protection. Since 2016, well, it was stopped until 2018 because we need to adjust a number of issues with regards to Big T, and since then it is hard for us to land on it. because I'm going back to what I said beforehand, we're not understanding the paradigm change. For example, the impact assessment about data which is compulsory with regards to health, or when you apply technologies, emerging technologies, and their convergence, and we are not ready to doing so. So on the one hand, we have a super production of laws, regulations, and rules, and on the other hand, the lack of a specific regulation which is being done already in Europe to regulate AI. But this creates a full paralysis because we have no time to process the information nor to see how these procedures, which allow us to guarantee these principles and these rights of trustable, trustworthy AI, robots, representative, which is what now Europe is working on, well, we can't make any headway. So on the other hand, we have the challenge that AI, to say so in simple terms, and I apologize for that, I'm going to be very straightforward because I'm not an expert of this issue, but there are a number of black boxes that do not allow us to have an explanation of the processes, which doesn't mean that we should just leave all decision-making processes to other people. When we do triage, when there are systems that are simpler, there must be a human correction. And in addition to it all, in order to avoid these biases and in order to identify them, citizens have new rights as well. We have the right to complain against automatic decision-making processes. And here we have the right that to be told how the algorithm has been programmed, what's the rationale and the reasoning behind it, and what is the decision they reach. But you need to explain that, well, that gap of knowledge, even if the result actually is beneficial, or it may not. And here we will understand better, because you can't face this. You need digital literacy, because you can't face this without any knowledge. But these are new rights. Like, for example, when human-assisted reproduction was discussed and what was the legal framework containing it. Well, here we have this new right to the portability of data. But people finally, at the end of the day, they frame it as it's something separate. Well, this is data protection. Well, this is also the protection of the economy. I mean, this focus should be holistic and almost cross-sectional. So, of course, these new rights, some people analyze it. But normally, when I make a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation related to this, you know, there was some headlines that appeared recently in the media. If it's a woman, it's a dryer, and if it's a man, it's a hammer. You know, that's what the AI system said, or George Bethers, who had to withdraw his algorithm for automated selection processes because he would never choose a woman. You explained it very, very well. Now, the Council of Europe, to end, since 2016, has prepared a number of patterns. You know that the European Council is an international organization that represents geographically Europe, and it is concerned about the protection of democracy, the state of, the state of law, etc. And it has developed a number of conventions and agreements, which is also related to data protection in this context, and a lot of legal issues that I'm not going to explain, but also it has developed a number of patterns that are very useful as a complement to this. In 2016 and 2017, it already published a number of patterns to guide operators and the legislative power and the political power in order to regulate the big data world, as it calls it, and recently anything related to AI. And I believe that it gives some very good patterns and some very good pieces of advice as a consequence of the guide of the group of people who go beyond the principles: human agency, diversity, accountability, etc., etc. Now, what the guideline says, especially the guideline about AI and data protection, is that, of course, these systems need to be based on the social consensus that there exists around the principles and rights that are respected in Europe. But what it also says is that operators, manufacturers, and all of the people who are in charge of these systems, they can't expect, or they can't wait until the citizen makes a complaint. They cannot transfer all of the responsibility to have a well-informed citizen that knows all about it, but they themselves have to be a previous analysis and a filtering of all of these issues. The quality of the data, before the development of the intervention, follow-up systems and monitoring systems to establish what they call at the European Council, and I believe this is a concept that we should also use, what they call algorithmic surveillance. Algorithmic surveillance in order to avoid this discrimination and these biases. And what it says is the following: we should not have this technology in excess. We need to develop behavioral codes, of course, but here there's also criticism. We see that every day they publish ethical codes about AI, which is a make-up operation. Is it aesthetic operation? Because, of course, the more lost we feel, everyone with his own code and sharing it. But at the end of the day, you do not know what's the consensus to assess or to evaluate. And we should also measure ourselves. And it is necessary to preserve the intervention, decision, and human correction. And now, precisely, it talks about public procurement systems where you need to be more demanding and more transparent. And what I would say is that in addition to encouraging you to reading it, what we have to do is to get out of this digital opacity in order to go towards this more transparent model that's more open, which it's going to be difficult for us because we're not used to this, and to make headway towards a governance model in which the data supplier and the person who will actually get it, normally it's the same person, they participate and they should define what are the priorities that should be tackled and responded to in a digital society that's guided by it. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, we'll now move on to Professor Allison Gardner. Allison?
You're muted, I think.
I had to mute because my dogs keep barking because the winter cleaner just arrived, which is just typical timing. So they're locked far away from me now. I am going to share my screen, so which means that I might disappear and you might just be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. So I apologise for that. So if you just bear with me 2 moments while I do this. We all know, we've all gone through this with COVID and lockdown. It's quite nice to see an event that's got live people at it. So, okay. So hopefully that has now worked and you can see the screen happily.
Yeah, we can see you also.
Yeah, and then if I just put myself there, you may actually even see me, and that might make it even nicer for you. There we go. So thank you. I've just had a worry that I've just brought the wrong one up, but never mind. It's not a lecture, but here we go. So I'm just going to just talk about some of the practical methods that we can do in terms of dealing with ethical AI and how we can address the issues of the lack of diversity, both within the teams that develop AI, but also within the data that we have. And I'm really pleased that a lot of the conversation has been about the awareness and the understanding of the citizen to understand the systems that they are impacting them and that are being used on them. And that is a huge, huge issue, which I may just end on at the end. So the whole field of ethical AI is extremely busy at the moment. So looking at how we can address the problems of the impacts of unfairness and discrimination as a result of biased algorithms that are going forward into the workplace, into society, that have really are ungoverned and are repeating the mistakes and embedding inequality in society from the discriminatory, biased data that we have collected, the historic data that has collected. And one thing that I will point out right at the very start is I have a concern with people trying to debias data sets. Key thing is you cannot fully debias a data set. It's been commented before that you can have combination of other variables that can allow for identification. You have proxy features that even if you remove certain protected characteristics from your data set, they will still stand in for that. And also if you remove those protected characteristics from your data set, you then can't test for bias afterwards. So I don't approve of that. And also you have a real issue, not just with unrepresentative, unbalanced data sets coming forward where there is an overrepresentation of men and an underrepresentation of women and other gender groups. I'm really pleased that that conversation happened earlier on. it's that you also have data of feature emission. So you have bias in the types of feature that you have, because we only collect data that we have thought to ask the questions for, that we thought to collect. And when you are dealing with, structural societal discrimination against women, we've only collected data that's really relevant to men. And the heart attack data is a classic example when we look at the symptomology and the causes of heart attack. And we have these data sets. Many systems are being developed using these standard data sets for heart attacks, but they are following sort of the male pattern of cardiac failure. But we know that women have very, very different symptomology, very different causes sometimes, and there's a whole slew of features that are missing. So even if you balance your data set in terms of representation of women and men within that data set, you can still have a biased system in terms of feature emission. And you can also, and here's a thought going forward, I haven't seen this mentioned much actually, even if you manage to develop an AI system that has been fully mitigated for any bias, and you can confidently sell that as an unbiased algorithm, that is being implemented. That's a neutral system being implemented in an arena that has got structural discrimination based upon it. So I would argue that by aiming for neutrality or equality rather than equity in your systems, you aren't still addressing any of the wider issues of bias. So it's a little bit of a complex argument but I think you'll understand what I mean, I hope. Anyway, back on track. So all around the sort of the arena, we are having a whole load of actions and initiatives around ethical AI. How can we practically make sure we address this issue of unfairness and biased AI systems and their impact? And I will focus on women because we are 50% of the population. So we do have frameworks, we have standards developing, we have something called algorithmic impact assessments, which is increasing in terminology and usage. We have AI audits now, which is the current fashion going forward. Certification will follow all of these systems, and regulation is hard to do, and it is lagging behind still all of these systems. And within the UK, there is actually resistance to very specific AI regulation. The argument is that there is plenty of other regulation already out there that we can use, like equality and law and human rights and so on and so forth, and that it has to be sector specific, and it covers for that, whereas it's very welcoming that the EU are looking at the whole arena of AI specifically. But that sort of still lags behind, and I'll touch on all of these very quickly because we're short of time. So 2 weeks ago, the EU released as one of the first, so it isn't actually the first, there's some other AI regulations that have been attempted elsewhere, such as in New York, which was so watered down that it became meaningless, which is a shame for transparency in AI. But this regulatory framework, the proposal of AI has been put out there for consultation, and they followed a really interesting approach looking at a risk assessment of AI and how they would categorise it, including unacceptable risk and actually outright banning, particularly of remote biometric surveillance mechanisms, and then the high risk, limited risk and minimal risk, and the actual procedures and the processes that you have to go to govern those systems and have them deployable vary depending on the risk assessment that you do. So, and this risk assessment is becoming a very big deal now. It seems to be the way that we're going along in trying to govern the process of developing ethical AI. So that is quite an interesting approach. It's under consultation, it will take a few years to do. But we do have GDPR, of course. There are about 85, we can talk about ethical AI principles, which was very welcome to do. And of course, we need to be very careful when we talk about ethics. Some of these, pointed out that, the ethical sort of framework for Finland may be different to Spain, maybe different to the UK, maybe different to Ghana, maybe different to India, and so on and so forth. So we need to think about the ethics and the ethical framework in which we do it. And many of them have a Western white male, let's be really honest, philosophical perspective. Some are actually global, so IEEEs and the EU commissions are quite good with that. But we have about 85 of them now, and this is some research done by the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and they did a deep dive into 36 of the better known ones. And did a thematic analysis of it. And what they found was various themes such as privacy, accountability, safety and security, transparency and explainability, which is the most popular, human control of technology, professional responsibility and promotion of human values. But they do have fairness and non-discrimination mentioned there, and it's listed as non-discrimination and prevention of bias, fairness, inclusiveness in design, inclusiveness in impact, and representative and high quality data and equality. And I'll just sort of tell you a little story. I get approached an awful lot by researchers now to go, we need to make our proposal ethical, Allison, and we need to, we've been told to make it more trustworthy. And then I'm in there trying to make sure that they address gender diversity properly. And they don't know how to do it. So one was a grant proposal that they did, and there was a section on it about how are you going to address gender and diversity in your project. And the answer that they did is, oh, we'll go and do some outreach in schools and speak to some girls. And it's that sort of ethics washing tick box approach, and they just genuinely wanted to do it properly, but this all male development group did not understand. And I said, no, you're meant to look at your development team. What is the team that's actually involved? How diverse is that? And of course, it wasn't diverse. You need to look at your mechanisms. So if, for example, you are labeling the data because you're doing supervised learning, what methodologies are you doing for that labeling process, and what quality assurance are you putting in there? So an example would be, if you are, and I did an AI audit, a bias audit on a system where they were categorizing, it was facial recognition, and they were categorizing people by the skin color, so into 6 categories, from dark to very, very white, and also other categories such as whether they have heavy makeup, light makeup, or no makeup. Now consider as somebody, and they had human labelers. Now consider the processes you put in there and the quality control. If you have a white male labeler, and they're the only person doing that labeling, how is their perspective on how they would label a female with very dark skin with makeup on, as opposed to a very pale white skinned female with heavy makeup on? How is their perspective, and would that change from that of a black female labeler, and so on? So this is the right down to the operational procedures that we have to employ when we are trying to develop ethical systems. We've all had a really good outline of why it's so important to do it. The impact of producing biased algorithms can actually, in the healthcare system, result in, and I'm not exaggerating, it can result in death of a patient if it is biased and things are missed. So particularly with female patients, and if you're doing a diagnostic algorithm, these are high risk. And they are quite interesting in that the EU regulatory proposals, they don't term any healthcare systems as it's not specified in healthcare as to whether it's high risk. And I would argue that healthcare systems, when they have direct impacts on a person, should be classified as high risk algorithms. So you need to think, it's not just about the high-end sort of approaches, oh yes, we need to be gender diverse in our team and think about algorithmic bias. It's the hard work of actually now delivering that in a meaningful way in the operational procedures that we develop. And another story that I will tell you is I sit on a number of grant review panels for AI proposals within the health sector, and the UKRI in UK, obviously, a research institute, spent over £1 billion last year on AI projects. And so some of these projects were going in, and I was reading all of these grant proposals. Very few dealt with gender diversity, very, very few dealt with algorithmic bias, very few touched on explainability or transparency. Fortunately, they did use participatory design, because we have quite strong in the healthcare industry about patient and public involvement and engagement. So this participatory design approach was very much involved, but again, not addressing the gender diversity issue, and it was quite hard. And there's bias even in what gets funded, because one person said, oh, this, and it was a really good application by a female researcher, and the answer was, oh, well, there isn't a senior academic there involved, and worried about her skills, you know, and the skills and the experience and the ability of this team to deliver this product. And I had to sort of step up and say, well, you know, what you're saying, because of the problems that we have within AI and the lack of diversity within the development teams, that if we have to have a senior academic for us to be able to agree to do a grant proposal, you're basically saying we need an old white male professor to show, be sure that this is an experienced team able to deliver. In which case, if you don't have that, you can't get funded. And so this bias is not just within the data. It's not just within the AI algorithm itself. It can exist in the whole arena of this very popular, very highly funded and very fast developing field. And like I said before, if we are not really careful and we aren't very activist about this, and we don't start thinking about practical methods of ensuring that we allow for AI to be developed ethically, we're going to embed inequality in our society. So keeping an eye on the time, and I've sort of got carried away, so I'm going to try and finish just about 10:20, if that's okay, and yell at me if you disagree. 10:20 my time, by the way. Diversity, this is another one. So this is the ethical AI principles and frameworks from the EU, and the AltAI assessment list for trustworthy AI, which I think is very good. And again, they have these 7 criteria, one of which is diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, and the avoidance of unfair bias, accessibility and universal design, and stakeholder participation. Because again, an argument that developers will make, especially startups, is, well, we're only small and it's all male, and how are we going to get the women in? And says, well, you can create ethics boards, you can create stakeholder engagement groups and bring them in, but they have to be involved in the project and not somebody you just go speak to and come in. And it has to be right from the identification of the business use case, because another bias that we have is that when we have all male viewpoints and business systems and people coming up with ideas, if they're all male, they'll come up with male-centric ideas, and we lose all of those female-specific use cases that we could start developing for, because we don't have those users, those developers, those women participants in right at the very beginning to think about how things could be developed, which is why you get stupid stuff like Fitbit's designed for women because they put on a little rose gold band, but yet they don't monitor for the menstrual cycle. And so that was held up. So they've now put the menstrual cycle, but of course they've termed it fertility, because obviously menstrual cycle must be about having babies, whereas from a woman's perspective, the menstrual cycle is about maybe not having babies. And of course, I am a 54-year-old woman. Oh no, I'm 55. My birthday was 2 days ago. Oh. I'm a 55-year-old woman who has been through the menopause. It was horrible, and yet I still don't see a lack of work on that one. So you miss these use cases. This is an example. Don't worry, there's lots of writing, but this is an example of part of a work package that I would develop for a research project, looking at how we would properly govern and ethically monitor an AI project. And of course, this is just from the regulatory governance point of view, where I'm saying, if we're developing a healthcare algorithm, we are going to start looking and adhering to certain standards that are being developed. So one, which is the BSI AIME 34971 standard of AI as a medical device, that's an addendum to the application of risk management to medical devices, that is ISO 14971. So there's a lot of stuff out there already that we can adhere to, and that is developing. And of course, there is already legislation and other standards, such as software as a medical device, that we can look on. But the question is what is AI different from software? How is AI different, and what's the extra requirements for AI systems that we need to consider? So that is one aspect of it, and there another paragraph will be that about how I would ensure that there is gender and diversity and inclusion within the project, and how you would do that, and it would have to be monitored. So this ethical oversight is really important, but it has to be granular, not high end. Oh yes, we're going to make it transparent and we're going to follow this ethical framework. It is what practical measures you are physically doing. And there is a whole host of other standards out there that are being developed. So the JTC1, which is an international body between ISO and IEC, and then there's over about 22 standards in AI being developed there. We have the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics and Autonomous Intelligent Systems, and I work on P7003, Algorithmic Bias Considerations, writing the algorithmic risk and impact assessment for that section. So they're all developing. And talking about algorithmic risk and impact assessment, which was again mentioned earlier, we have DPIAs. There is an argument that these can be extended, but these are basically risk identification, risk analysis, and risk mitigation that you can go forward for in the process. This is a developmental process, it's iterative, and it has to be ongoing, and it has to have evaluation going forward. The Ada Lovelace Institute do a really nice definition of what algorithmic risk and impact assessments are, because there is a big confusion between AIAs now and AI audits, and people are sort of jumping between the two, and the literature can get very confusing. So I do recommend their black box report, which identifies algorithmic risk and impact assessments as one that is assessing possible societal impacts on algorithmic systems for the systems in use. So the framework you would have for your AIA would address gender and diversity, inclusiveness of the team, identification of bias, and so on and so forth. But again, practical measures, and then an impact evaluation. So post-deployment, seeing whether, what is the ongoing impact, and these need to be repeated every time the use case drifts along. I will ignore that one. So I would always say that these algorithmic impact assessments should be completed iteratively, involve all stakeholders, conducted by the diverse project team, provide an auditable trail of documentation, and we would love it to be public, or a public version of it. Audits, Ada Lovelace define it as a bias audit, a target non-comprehensive approach focusing on assessing algorithmic systems for bias, including the development of and the stakeholder engagement of, I would argue. And then, of course, a regulatory inspection, which is compliance to regulation, compliance to standards going forward. There are mechanisms now to how to practically do that. So Raji et al., or Timnit Gebru's team that were of Google, have come up with addressing the accountability gap and an end-to-end framework for internal algorithmic audit. But of course, there needs to be external auditing going forward to ensure adherence to all of these processes. And they have quite a nice design there of how you're doing, what AI principles you're using, your use case ethics review, social impact assessment, audit checklists, ethical risk analysis chart is in there as well, and so on and so forth. So there are models coming out for practical management of projects. So rather than, we are going from the sort of why should we look at ethical AI to actually how can we now do it. One issue that we do have, and again going back to previous speakers, the passion about the AI awareness of the public and their ability to know that they are actually subject to algorithmic systems and that they can be biased is a real concern. And their actual right to challenge, as defined in the GDPR, for example, cannot happen unless they know that they are impacted by such a system, which is why transparency is such an important impact. And when you're impacting on the majority of the vulnerable groups, they are the people less likely to be AI aware and informed, and less likely to know how to go forward and actually demand redress. And so there is still a huge issue of managing that field of the entire field of AI governance. So we do need to be AI aware. So thank you to everybody who mentioned that one. But we now need to think about, we have lots of ethical principles. We have lots of, regulation is now coming. The standards are coming. We now need to think about how we can practically deal with it. And again, address it with gender and diversity. I will close, having overrun slightly, with the fact that in computer science, where all of the other sciences and subjects such as law, for example, as well, are increasing their gender diversity, for example, in the intake of students into universities. In the world of computer science, we're actually going backwards. We're still going backwards because there is active pushback on women that's not addressed, and maybe in the conversation later on, if we have time, I'll explain some more about that personal experience and how discrimination and bias really impacts in the field of computer science still. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, for your time. So now we're going, vamos a la última presentación con Paula Petrone.
All right, let's move on to the last presentation with Paula Petrone. So take it away. Well, I'm a physicist. I was trained as a physicist, and so I am devoted to artificial intelligence and computer learning. I've mostly worked in the pharmaceutical industry, though I have lately transitioned into academia, so I like to offer both perspective of what the uses of artificial intelligence is. But before that, I would like us, since we're talking so much about the scientific and regulatory perspective, to focus on society. So we're talking about biases today. Biases are cultural artifacts. If we step into the shoes of citizenship, we can consider, how do citizens today conceive artificial intelligence? If we think about AI, it is almost impossible to not harken back to the utopias presented by film and science fiction literature, where they show us perfect analytical, objective machines able of cede to our decisions and our responsibilities. Machines like Wall-E, which are able to transcend us when we're no longer on this planet, which are automatical machines who make automatical decisions, almost empathy and creativity-based decisions. Sometimes we fantasize about machines that may interpret our desires. And the personal favorite is this movie, Her, where we have this operating system which has feelings to the point where the system falls in love with its owner and then decides to leave him after a while to explore its freedom and conscience. So conscience-based machines. So all these utopias or dystopias have been fed back with these scientific milestones in the field of computer sciences, such as the 2017 case where the algorithm AlphaGo from DeepMind company beat the Go world champion. So this powerful algorithm is an optimization algorithm capable to calculate the best play in a universe of possible plays. So not just that, this algorithm is also capable of self-learning and perfect itself with each game. And this is what we call enforced learning. So this succession of milestones have accumulated and have started inflating this media bubble, which is really confusing the population about the actual reach of artificial intelligence. And this affects us all. It affects us already in funding, it affects our exchanges, or it affects the decisions we make or we allow machines to make for us. These algorithms, having beat someone at a Go game doesn't mean that a machine is intelligent. The same way, someone who is a Go or chess champion may not necessarily be intelligent in other aspects of life. So we need to start thinking about how our society conceives artificial intelligence. We have this technological efficiency, technocracy, versus other aspects of intelligence, such as emotional intelligence, creativity, or empathy. Now, when we talk about artificial intelligence and human intelligence, intelligence is a lot more complex. And one of the factors, one of the attributes of human intelligence is precisely its generality, its ability to respond not just to one problem, but to many and simultaneously. Besides, intelligence also implies to break established rules and to create. Today, no matter what the media tells us, or what films tells us, or what conspiracy theories tells us, intelligent computers, in the broad sense of the word, do not exist. And that's something very important because we may not concede our decision-making ability to these computer systems. What we do have, which is really powerful, is what in computer sciences is called narrow artificial intelligence, which means that we have algorithms or software that is capable of solving one task at the same time, one specific, well-defined task. These algorithms, as we define them today, feed on data. This data is fed into a model, which is basically a mathematical function. And what it does, or what it calculates the probability of success of one fact. And what these algorithms do is to produce predictions that are translated into actions. And they're successful on many accounts. For instance, marketing, image identification, self-driving vehicles, automatic translation. Over the last 5 years, they're starting to be validated, and not completely, in the field of medicine. However, far from being automatized, these processes are 100% humanized, as my colleagues were saying. There are humans involved in every aspect of artificial intelligence, from data acquisition and data control and integration and the decision of which data to use, to the formulation of the question which the algorithms will give an answer to. Then there's the developer, male or female, that tells the algorithm which variables to incorporate and which variables are not prioritized in the model. Then we have analysts that interpret these decisions, and ultimately we have the people making the decisions. For that reason, these algorithms, seeing how they're made 100% by and for humans, the algorithms understand and capture our reality. They capture our subjectivity, our beliefs, our priorities, our egos, our economic interests, and our political interests. And in summary, as we've seen on this panel, there are two important factors that are hurdles in the performance of equity-based artificial intelligence. So first is biases, and the second one is data poverty. If we talk about design biases, and I'm going off of what Karina said here, we may think that we create our devices and our systems in our likeness. And I'd like to give a very powerful example of biases when we talk about virtual personal assistants. These virtual assistants over the past few years have the shape and voice of women, of young women, that very politely and docilely and kindly help us. And they gently, always give a gentle response even when we abuse and mistreat them. For example, their serious famous response, "Ooh, I'd blush if I could," when she's insulted. And we have all these assistants in homes today, such as Alexa and Cortana. Luckily, the famous Irene from the Spanish railway network was phased out in 2018. 2019 saw the importance of these biased algorithms that condition cultural stereotypes. If we take into account, how is it possible that these biased devices exist? We may think that only 12% of developers on AI teams are female, and most of them don't occupy decision-making roles.
Another example, another very interesting example, it's my favorite. The case of automatic translation by Google. And here I show you an example from last night, when I wanted to translate a text from Finnish to Spanish. Finnish is a language that has neutral pronouns. It is called, some Finns call their language the language of equality. For example, Hans means he or she. Now, when you introduce a text in Finnish and you translate it into Spanish, they choose pronouns that are more related to the context and cultural cliches. For example, he drives a car, she dances, she does the laundry, the boss talks to his secretary, the nurse a female nurse treats patients, and the president is always a man. Now, this is not surprising. These are algorithms trained with millions of documents that actually reflect these cliches. Now, whose responsibility is it? Of course, the responsibility is in the hands of developers. And Google has invested a lot of money and effort during last years to actually correct these cliches, these stereotypes. This is just from last night. So the success they have had has not been a good one. The main liability, though, is on citizens. We users should demand equality and the suppression of these biases that we use every day. These are algorithms we use every day. Now, I'm going to talk about biases with regards to biomedical issues in biomedicine. We could think that these biases have other type of sources. They're quite surprising. I believe that nowadays we all know that our data are being acquired every day without us realizing it with our devices, our tablets. When we are in the internet, they capture minute after minute our location, what we eat, how much sleep do we get, where we are. Our data are included in the clinical electronic histories now, or records. Now, when those of us who are working and developing these models, we are trained in AI models, we find that a lot of data are missing. And this has been covered by the Lancet article published last month. They call it data poverty in healthcare. What does that mean? It means that there are a lot of people, many populations or individuals who are not represented. We already talked about this. My panel colleagues have talked about this. But for example, there are some algorithms applied to dermatology to detect skin cancer that works better in white skins than in dark skins, because the biopsy images is not enough, it does not have enough representation of dark skins. We talk about sex and gender. Karina already mentioned it. It's very important to be able to notice this sort of variables. It's not the same thing to predict depression in a woman than in a man, and we know that these variables are not binary. The socio-economic status, not all people have the same access to digital devices or to health. These people are less represented in data or some geographic representation. There are some countries that have not yet digitized their health systems, and there are some variables that are ignored due to taboos, cultural taboos. An example is puberty age, both in men and in women. These data are normally missing, and they are vital for biomedical studies. Now, why? Because data have not been acquired and they're poorly modeled. There are many populations that are poorly represented. They are underrepresented. And this is a reason why it has an unequal representation and performance in different population strata. Now, what concerns me, and this is what concerns my colleagues, I believe, too, is the deregulated implementation of AI, where the human being is not involved, or it concedes, it gives priority to the algorithms. Today's data are a snapshot of the present and of the close past. If we feed these algorithms with pegged data, the decisions they will be making will be affected by this. If we model a present that's unequal, in the future, we will not all benefit equally from it. Now, I would like to sound pessimistic. In fact, I'm a rather optimistic person, and I believe that AI has a lot of applications and an enormous potential, especially in the biomedical area. A physician has 20 minutes to care for a patient, and there are many things that are missing, but technology can help them. But as has been already mentioned by my panel colleagues, to manage and implement a responsible type of use of it, how can we go about it? There are two ways. One is transparency. You do not need to understand why Netflix will recommend one film and not another one, or how chess application, a chess program, will win the best chess player in the world. We can understand that, but in biomedicine, in talent, in credit, in justice, transparency in these algorithms is absolutely crucial. Now, there is a lot of progress being made in this field in terms of transparency. There are algorithms that have been developed in the last 4 years that are called explainable AI. Now, these algorithms start opening up these black boxes and they explain why they carry out certain predictions. Not all of them use them, but these algorithms have already been developed and they are available for being used. For the biomedical area, this fascinates me because they can explain not only why a prediction, why a diagnosis, but also they can give us new ideas and new hypotheses about how to cure these illnesses and, for example, how to discover new biomarkers. It is very optimistic the fact that already last month the European Commission has pronounced itself already again, and it has talked about the risk in AI, and it has made a regulatory proposal for countries. AI with this proposal can be determined as high risk, medium risk, and low risk, but there is never zero risk. The following point, as my colleagues have already mentioned, is recruiting and funding of diverse AI teams, especially when we talk about gender. It is very important to include women, but not only in STEP areas, but in any other discipline. And how do we include or how do we recruit female talent? A part or a way of doing it, which is quite specific, is to use inclusive language during the interviews and when you publish jobs. We oftentimes do not think about this, but it's so important. Women feel attracted when certain words are used in ads. For example, words that talk about passion, learning, responsibility, communication, words that talk about creativity, motivation, commitment, diversity. Women do not respond well when there are some gender-coded terms, when there are too many requirements, because we feel we're not able. Hopefully, this attitude will change in due time, and for that we need to train girls, well, starting by making them believe or to be self-confident so that they can really attain anything they want. But in the society as it is today, this is not the case. We feel oftentimes that we do not deserve what we have, and we need to attract this female talent, and for that we need to reduce the amount of requirements and to focus on the learning opportunities. I'd like to encourage the whole community to take this advice on board, and you will see a change in teams. 2 years ago I needed to recruit a team, and it resulted that 100% of the participants were men, until somebody told me, you should revisit your job ad. And I followed this content, this piece of advice, and this has given very good results. But we do have good news. When there is regulation and diversity, there is even progress. In the last few years, we have new apps that focus on women's health. In 2018, Fitting, the company, decided to introduce to its smartwatch data a monitoring of the menstruation. And based on this, in the last few years, there are many startups led by mixed teams, led by women and mixed teams. For example, our WIM, which is a monitoring of fertility and a fertility predictor. There are also applications that manage menopause. They detect cancer, cervix cancer and others, and breast cancer as well. Now, you do not need, I believe, to think or dream with these future utopias in which machines will decide on our behalf. It is easier. It is much more practical to focus on a present that's realistic and tangible. And that's why we do not talk about AI anymore. We're starting to talk about augmented intelligence. This is the human intelligence that is augmented, enriched by these digital technologies, which allow us to make better decisions, well-informed decisions that are adjusted for everybody. Thank you for having given me the opportunity to share with you my thoughts. Thank you. Thank you, Paula. Fine. So, well, thank you very much indeed to the four of you for these very, very interesting presentations, each one of you with your own perspective. You have completed the main topic, and with some very common concerns amongst all of you. We have talked about, I mean, in addition to defining the different types of biases and how they can affect the development of technology and its impact on society, you have all talked about liability and responsibility in terms of innovation, the responsibility of people who are part of any process of design, development of AI, or new technologies, or any other new technology. Given that we have very little time left for Q&A, I had thought about a number of questions for each one of you, but what I'm going to do rather is to leave, I'm going to ask the questions and you can answer, any one of you can answer them, and if there is discussion generated, it's going to be perfect. And maybe you can answer a few things. So, on the one hand, Karina has mentioned at the beginning of her presentation, and I believe it would be very good to know your opinion about whether you believe that the use of AI nowadays in the health sector, which is what we're focusing on, could end up creating risks to magnify these inequalities created due to the biases, new discriminations, or exactly the opposite. Do you think it's going to offer opportunities to be able to combat that? So, for example, Karina, would you like to respond? Yes. Well, to be honest, this is a big question mark. The way I see it, right now, we are we're talking about a discipline that's quite old, and there is only a little iceberg tip that's actually being seen. You know, the black boxes, the database, the big data, and the algorithms. But what I say is that to start, and I believe that to integrate an emerging technology in an ecosystem, which is what our society is all about, is an exercise of responsibility that involves all actors. Everybody has to play his or her own role here. In the same way, somebody doesn't know anything about pharmacy, but if he or she knows, if you use an aspirin, you should not have a coffee. And this is, it is the person's own responsibility and the pharmaceuticals company's own responsibility. I mean, you cannot put into the market something that kills you. I mean, it's the same here. AI professionals have to make a responsibility exercise. And on the other hand, citizens do have the responsibility to acquire all of the knowledge needed to be able to decide, to make a well-informed decision, to know how you want to relate yourself with the AI that surrounds you. Something else is that there are other AIs that exist, institutional AI, where you have no choice. And here it is, the thinking process is more institutional based. But in the consumption world, you as a responsible consumer, and in academia, we're doing a significant work to trying to disseminate and to create this AI culture. In the same way, you know which button you need to press to make the dishwasher work. Well, you have to do the same with AI. I mean, this has come here to stay. It will never leave. And in fact, there is a lot of AI. We have a lot at home, and we have them on our wrists for 1 year, always. And so we can't withdraw from this issue. That's one point. The second point is, okay, let me link up with something very interesting that Itziar said beforehand. These are new rights. We can demand to a system, it should inform us how the algorithm makes decisions on our behalf. Well, this is new and not that new. I don't know when this right disappeared, but beforehand, there was a right that any citizen had to demand some justification, a reasoned, well-reasoned justification for any evaluation process in which he or she was part of as a citizen. So if in this evaluation process there is an algorithm, in fact, this is not a new right. It's a right that a lot of people do not know about, and they do not exercise it. But I mean, now it has this more technological shape about it. But this is a right we all have as citizens. We should be explained, we should be told when they tell us to go here or there, what reason lies behind that decision. Now, with all of the concern we opened a degree in AI in September, and it has an ethical course about it. It's not really cross-sectional, but it's subject matter that's as important as mathematics, because we believe that this is an issue that requires that the professional part in our sector should be aware about all of this. But in the field of biases that we're focusing on, I think that biases, in fact, they are not the outcome of a poor application or a bad exercise. No. In part, they are due to the fact that we're very fast-paced. The lead time to market makes us to place in the market things that have not been tested out sufficiently beforehand. And when Microsoft created an international standard, I mean, I can launch an operational system that has loops into it, and nothing happens. That has had implications in all of the software developed after that. And in fact, biases, in part, is a result of that. But with regards to AI, there is an area that's not as well known, which is called knowledge engineering. And amongst other things, they work not only in the field of acquiring information, but they work on something else that to me is crucial, the implicit knowledge of human beings. And it is here, it is where the person who designs makes a decision and he or she does not realize the consequences of the decision, not because it's a bad decision, because oftentimes there are a number of implicit outcomes that he or she has not thought out enough. And it is here when we eat up data in AI without realizing, it's not that we're not surveillant, but we do not realize that a specific decision is reducing the representativeness of these data. For example, now with COVID-19, one day, at the beginning of the pandemic, and the health ministers said so, we have changed the protocol. After tomorrow, COVID-19 patients will be locked down. This is a decision that, from a health point of view, makes every sense in the world. But it does have a terrible implicit consequence for all of the people who have worked in the pandemic modeling. These locked down patients have not had a PCR. They are not part of the figures. We have not counted them ever, right? So this, which is an implicit decision, if you have a knowledge engineering, he could warn you. I mean, this decision that is being made, you may make it, but you must know that we will not be able to have good pandemic predictive models after today, unless you include, I don't know what else. And then we realized that people were looking for the number of people infected in undertakers' premises, and they did not know whether the person had died out of cancer or COVID, but you could label it, and all of these things play a big role. So you need to have a double-fold exercise of responsibility, and we do it well, and this requires some time for development. The artificial intelligence can help us, solve many inequality problems that we have nowadays, and they can help us solve them. If we do it badly, they will increase. AI will increase inequality. Before giving you the floor, could you show us Allison on screen? Because she's part of this Q&A session as well. Yes, very quickly. in order to reach the discussion. When you have talked about the continuity principle, I agree. We learn from this and from what experts tell us. But then we have access to data in transparent conditions, and then the decisions that are made in the real world, they do have an explanation, and the decision has to be based on scientific evidence. So you have to take into account it's a big cocktail, it's a big mixture. It is an opportunity. It depends. It depends on us to make the decision, but it's a shared social responsibility. You do not make a decision autonomously. It depends on who you have in front, what explanations he or she gives you, etc., etc. It's not that the right has appeared and disappeared. No, rights are subject to being revisited and changed and amended. The right is, a right is not an isolated thing. But if we create rights to respond to technology, as has always been the case, if they are not implemented, because neither the systems do so, nor the operators are educated and aware and trained to allow for the conditions of exercising the right, then we have identifiable rights and wonderful texts. But you have said so very well. If we do it well, we're already doing it. It's not that we've been called summoned here to see which decision we will make in a couple of years' time because we have enough time. No, you have explained it. As ISGLOBAL, we at the University of Barcelona, the study of his clinical record and the study of physicians' handwritings which are unintelligible. What I mean is, okay, it has always been a challenge, but I believe that we're excessively influenced by market dynamics. The market dynamics to be profitable. Well, we have to stop that. This speed, which also has an influence, but this is this is classical for the genre. For AI and for genetics. But I loved what Paula said, and I've always thought AI. The very name artificial intelligence is not well. Is not well created. The words we use are very important as well, and this could help us. But of course, citizens at large have to actually take. They have to take the power. Would you like to add anything? Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, there are 2 questions from the audience. I'm going to ask it in English.
Progress towards practical steps, requiring that AI models can be rerun, compared, checked, etc.
Contestamos. Quien quiera.
Sí, es general.
Es general.
Who would like to answer? It's a generic question. Allison, would you like to answer that? Allison, you're muted. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Practical steps, like requiring that AI models can be rerun, compared, checked, etc.
You can't hear? You can hear, but you can't speak. Oh my God.
Mientras la regla podemos ir avanzando.
No está bien.
Ahora. ¿No? Allison?
We cannot hear you, Allison.
We can't hear you, Allison. Can't you do anything about it? Well, I do not agree about this. Okay, the data are not shared. So, oftentimes, a lot of things are funded based on projects that are focused on a very reduced amount of data. First, there is no access to validation about these data because they do not share them. Secondly, they do not share the models. And thirdly, they carry out some marketing strategies of a technology that we do not know whether it's real or whether it's in work in progress. To me, this is quite scary. But what we need to do is, to make these algorithms to be validated in a compulsory way. Well, But what you're saying about data access is the point we need to work out. These are sensitive data, and therefore we have not solved the problem of super inclusion. I mean, as long as we do not solve that, we'll have a problem. We're talking about company data. For example, if a company creates a product based, an AI product based on data, and for trade secret they do not share it, and they do not publicize an algorithm. But that algorithm has never been validated, and there is no way to validate it. And in many consulting projects, I have had to validate a technology. There is no way of assessing it to know whether it's an accurate algorithm or not. Well, I believe that here we have another discussion, to be honest. Another discussion that is related to the business model linked to AI implications. I mean, nowadays, I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm just going to describe the facts. Nowadays, nobody thinks of asking Moderna to open their vaccine molecule. No. And yet, it has a direct effect on people's lives. Now, I believe that here we need to think. I mean, one thing is that we believe that in order to be able to launch an AI product to the market, we have to go through an audit with qualified people who come and internally revise and say, well, they certify, etc., etc. This is compliant, and we should not launch something that will be writing, in Google, or somebody who downloads it and uses it without knowing anything about it. I mean, we need to control what's being launched to the market so that it truly complies with the requirements. And something altogether different is that we have to think that companies that need to live out of building up software for AI need to tell us the algorithms, their industrial secrets, etc., etc. So, I believe that we need to think in depth about this and to think about where we are, because the software industry already has some problems. Apps are for free. Which architect will give you an urban planning map or plan for free? You know, an architect will actually ask you to pay, and nobody asks the architect to actually give all of it for free and then live out of ads and data. So we have come into this problem on our own, because if a software generating company, okay, if you have to give the software for free, the company needs to invent things in order to be able to get enough income to keep its company. So if you can't sell the software, what do? Well, you are being monitored, and then the company sells your data. Now, it is a horrible combination, and people should sit down and give value to what has value. People have to pay for what needs to be paid. I mean, I'm not saying that software has to be paid for, but somebody should sit down and think about the business model lying behind it all. Because in addition to it all, there is another component. The software is intangible, it is delocated, and it lives in cyberspace. In other words, China, which does not have the same model that we have in Europe, where tracking people is not even contested by the population, because they have a different ethical code, and they launch an app that Mr. Smith has here in a different context without going from anywhere. You know, no tariffs, no nothing, no customs. It is in cyberspace, So our industry is being affected by this. I mean, we need to compete with all of these other people. So we should also think about what are the additional costs represented by this conservative European approach for our industry, and what are the consequences for this. And with this, I insist, I'm not saying that, I'm not positioning myself, I'm just describing a problem that to me is just gigantic. It is related to the feasibility of the European industry, and of course it has an impact on citizens And if we are not careful, it will have an impact in ways that are not desirable, but this has other variables that should be questioned and to place it in a global context, because the software industry is not like the toy industry that, our ministry says, okay, I've withdrawn all of the toys from our shops. No, this has to be part of the equation as well.
Well, honestly, I do not have an answer to this kind of issues, but it's a big problem. Do we have any more questions? There is another question.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion numbers. Are similar developments seen in the field of AI? Are AI developers publicly explaining how they account for biases?
Allison, would you like to say something?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, so again, sound is a little bit difficult. So how companies could detect biases, was that the question?
How they include diversity, I think it was?
Yeah, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Equity and inclusion, yeah.
Thank you. Again, it's these practical measures that take, to the previous question, yes, we run a very strong risk that even de-biased or fair systems can actually cause bias and embed it in inequality, because when you test for fairness, sometimes they disagree with each other and can cause bias. So it's a challenge. In terms of diversity and inclusion, I get really annoyed by this, because this has been dealing with, known for a long time how we deal with these things, and yet we're still meeting issues that aren't properly addressed, and we have to look at smaller nudges. So it was mentioned earlier about making sure that your job adverts are inclusive in language, and of course we have AI that actually allows you to test your systems for that, so that is really quite good. There's interesting processes. I still see it a lot where it is known that when you advertise for a job, if you do not quote the salary, women are less likely to apply for that position. So these are small operational nudges that need to be taken in place. But in terms of how in AI and technology, I think it has to be hard coded into how you govern the process. I really think that if you have not got a diverse team, or you have mitigated for a non-diverse development team by having stakeholder engagement, you do not get the funding. You do not get the stamp or for ethical adherence to that this is trustworthy AI, because it has not been developed with with a wide diverse perspective on it, and it doesn't get bought and it doesn't get deployed. And I just think we need to be a little bit hardcore. And one thing that I would really like to do, because we've been dealing with this now for decades in the field of computer science, and we've tried every initiative going to try and deal with the lack of diversity within computer science, and specifically within AI, is to flip the question. Stop asking why women aren't coming into AI. Why are they leaving AI? 45% of women in the technology industry leave within the first year, citing, for example, the hacker culture and the testosterone level of culture that is produced. So we need to flip the question, and we need to say, instead of why don't we have enough women and how can we include them, we need to say, well, why do we have too many men, and how can we redress that balance, and what can they do about it? And we've got to turn it on the head. And every time I say that in a conference, all of the hands get folded back, and you can see the bristling of the men. But the onus is on them. This used to be, machine learning used to be considered a machine-grade position that was predominantly women. And it was only when it became a value-driven and high-value career path that women got pushed out by active operational processes and recruitment processes, and defining the very language of AI, which is why we have toolboxes rather than sewing boxes, and we have penetration testing, and we have termination, and all of this adversarial approach, testing. It's all of this language. It's really embedded in the subject, and we need to go hardcore, and we need to drill down and start changing it and start taking it back, because we won't deal with the problem of diversity and inclusiveness in AI and computer science, because we've been trying now since the early decades of the last century. So flip the question. embed it in the monitoring and governance processes of AI for trustworthy AI, so that there is a profit incentive involved with it, that they need to make it embedded in that one, and they will have to do it, and it has to be meaningful. And it's no good, by the way, having a woman participant in the group who is doing the ethics and the governance. They need to be the developers as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Brilliant. I don't know if we have time for...
No sé si...
Ok, hay alguna pregunta más del público. Dice,
Right, we have another question from the audience. Do we need any sort of special protection for genomic data that identify one specific individual? I think that one's for me, right? Yeah. Well, yes, obviously, this data is already protected. These are special categories. And they also include biometric data. And the answer is yes, of course. And also the world that we're laying bare here, where data is being released intensively, we need to keep into account that some data are properly protected and not within reach of just about anybody, and that's how it needs to remain. Everyone has our data, but some data no one can access, and those are mostly health data. And whoever wants to export them and access them obviously needs to have the proper credentials and needs to know where to ask for them, because obviously they can't just be released anyway. So the answer is yes, and the protection is guaranteed. I don't know, I have time for one very last question. And this was a general question to all of you, given what has been going on for the past year with the pandemic. So my question is, what do you believe? Well, I'm going to ask it in English, and then Allison can follow along.
The accelerated digital transformation of health systems prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic is exposing society to risks of an irresponsible use of artificial intelligence.
Yes, I'll very quickly jump in there, and then this is the problem. You have the dual use problem with technology in AI, where you can use AI systems for very good reasons. They seem to be very, helpful and very useful, but there is a dual use of it, that particularly when you change regulation to allow them, that would allow for surveillance and for imbalanced development. And so you do have to be very, very careful and very, very critical of AI systems or any technology that is deployed, and you need to consider the dual use problem. So one example would be not necessarily COVID related, but in helping refugees and managing refugees' journeys and their rights. And you can develop AI systems to allow for that, but it does also mean that they can be tracked and monitored where they're going forward, and that reduces their civil liberties. So what can be offered as a helpful device can also be treated as something very concerning. And the Singapore tracker device did that with foreign workers, and there was an added functionality to that actually put different rights and controls on them compared to the ordinary citizen, which is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No sé si queréis añadir.
I think maybe we can switch also to the positive side of COVID that has really powered these new technologies, especially in the area of telemedicine. We now understand we don't need to go to the doctor for every reason. There are a lot of appointments that can be done online, and this also is applied to pediatrics and for women's health. So mental health, mostly more important. So I think also we can say that COVID has helped. Even there are some biases, but I think has been moreover like positive experience.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Entonces creo que lo vamos a dejar ya.
All right. I think we have to leave it here for today. Thank you so very much to the four of you for being here today and for your contributions. Personally, I have enjoyed it greatly. I learned loads listening to you, and I hope our audience did as well. And I would just like to invite everyone to the last session in our talk, in the sex and gender bias talks, which will take place on June 16th. And Dr. Rhonda Shigenby and Katarina D'Ignazio will be with us. So this is it. Thank you very much.